Distinguished members of the audience, I see the former minister and my colleague sitting among us. I'm deeply honored to be associated with this event, but I'm also extremely relieved that I'm not in the competition. So I don't have to worry whether the jury will judge me appropriate or not to be included among the prize winners. Power is a very heady brew. There are very, very few people who can assume power and not be changed by it, changed generally for the worse. And that is why there was an American senator who used an expression, not about an individual, but about his own country, when he talked about the arrogance of power. I have had opportunities of being suddenly catapulted to positions that I never thought I would get. And my wife has always said to me that you're not the same. And it's very much better when I lose power and I just become an ordinary individual. And I've been reflecting on why this should be so. I think basically it is that the very qualities that drive people to seek power are the qualities which then bring that person down. And that while it's very easy to accept the fruits of success, it's much more difficult for people who are in the power game to accept defeat. And really, the strength of an individual who chooses to go into the power game depends upon the ability to withstand reverses, to have the psychological ability to take defeat and to allow yourself to believe that you will win again. It's generally an illusion, but unless and until an individual who's in the power game has the capacity to look at life and say there is not going to be an upward trajectory. The moment I reach the peak is the moment when my descent to the valley begins. And when I hit the floor of the valley, that is when my rise to the top again begins. Unless there is this peculiar mentality that is willing to take defeat in its stride because the desire for victory is so overwhelming that the disappointments of defeat can also be accepted, it's not possible to be in the power game. But to be in the power game is not to have very many virtues. There are very few people who are able to combine morality and the search for power. Indeed, very often, it is people who are not in the search for power, but who have it gifted to them, who ultimately prevail in history. And an excellent example of that is Mahatma Gandhi, who kept insisting that he was neither a saint nor a politician. But because his entire politics was woven around an ethic that normally does not lead to victory or success, and yet somehow he succeeded, that his name continues in history. Otherwise, if you regard people who've won power, they usually lose it by the same means by which they got it. Therefore, through history, monarchs have come to power wading through blood. Having sat on the throne, they then depart swimming through their own blood. And in dictatorships, I've had the pleasure, privilege of serving in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. I saw what power he exercised and how he exercised it with an amazing amount of callousness and an amazing amount of cruelty. But think also of how it ended, with him hiding like a rat in a hole and being discovered there, and then maltreated to the point of his walking towards the gallows and somebody abusing him seconds before the rope was put around his neck. Or consider those who, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, started the non-aligned movement. If you're a Dilliwala like I am, then you can remember their names because many of the roads in Delhi are named after them. But the curious thing is that if you now go to their home country, you can't see a single statue, you can't see a single road named after Nkrumah in Ghana. You can't see anything named after Nasser in Egypt. Sukarno is a forgotten and reviled character in his own homeland. And I'm not sure how many Cypriots remember Archbishop Macarius. And as for Marshal Tito, who was among the founding fathers, not only is he forgotten, but his country is forgotten. It doesn't exist anymore. He formed Yugoslavia as a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic entity of 9 different units. And now all those 9 units have broken one by one. But we have Archbishop Makarios Marg, we have Nasser Marg, we have Tito Marg. We even have a statue of Lenin in the Nehru Park. But you can't find a statue of Lenin in what used to be the Soviet Union. I'm giving these examples to show how power is very, very transient. A few years ago, if I'd mentioned the name Iacocca, everybody in this audience would have remembered or would have known that he was the head of General Motors. So whether it's in business or in politics or even in academics, what happens is that you are hailed as an academic for having knocked out somebody whose theory was prevalent until then. But you last only until some younger scholar comes and knocks you out of the running. But perhaps it is in politics that we see the search for power at its most vulgar, at its most obvious. Because compared to political power, there is no other kind of power, corporate power or journalistic power or academic power, that can compare in its glamour, in its glitter. If you become Prime Minister or Chief Minister, inevitably that day is going to come in a democracy when you cease to be Prime Minister or Chief Minister. In the United States, they have put this into the Constitution. You cannot be president for more than 2 terms. And if you become president like Bill Clinton did when he was in his mid-40s, then by his early 50s, he was an ex-president. And yet, he had another 30 years to live. And every morning when he wakes up and shaves, he must be looking in the mirror and saying, this is the face that used to be the most powerful face in the world, but is now only that of an ex-president. You think of Tony Blair in the United Kingdom. When he became Prime Minister, after having served in Parliament for only a little over 10 years, one said, what an amazing victory. And yet today, his philosophy has been rejected. The new Labour Party has been taken over by a man from the opposite end of the spectrum, Jeremy Corbyn. And he himself is constantly under questioning for his role in supporting the United States lie that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and therefore deserved to go. So whether it is Bill Clinton or Gaddafi lying in a gutter, begging to be saved and being kicked even after his body died and hated in his afterlife, as much as he thought he was being loved while he was there. All power seems to be very transient. What survives then? I look at Jawaharlal Nehru. I see that there is a serious attempt on, right now, to try and denigrate him, to describe him as somebody who looked down upon and scorned Sardar Patel, who was perhaps involved in the death of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Lies, but that's what can happen to your reputation, that people can come up and say these things. What were his achievements? He'll take a historian or somebody who's really a student of politics to quickly recall what happened in 1947, what happened in 1951. It's quicker to remember 1962 when he got badly defeated in the war with China. So what remains? In the case of Mahatma Gandhi, what remains is the ideal of ahimsa and satyagraha. Historians can and will pick upon the performance of these people. And particularly in the current age, we see attempts to build up Dr. Ambedkar by denigrating Mahatma Gandhi. But what no one can deny is that the only politician in history to have actually used the instrument of non-violence and non-cooperation in order to overthrow the world's mightiest empire was Gandhi, and less Gandhi than an idea that he had, which must have seemed pretty ridiculous at that time, that you can persuade the British to go home. There would be historians today who would say with some justification that if Adolf Hitler had not come and started the Second World War, which resulted in the bankruptcy of the British Empire, the British would not have gone. Or that if Subhash Chandra Bose had not started the Indian National Army, there would not have been a revolt in the Royal Indian Navy, which so frightened the British, who thought 1857 was coming back, that they decided to quit before they were murdered. These theories and thoughts can be spun. But the fact remains that whatever the historicity, the truth or untruth of these kinds of charges, no one can deny that Mahatma Gandhi valorized an ethical principle, the ethical principle of nonviolence, the ethical principle of fighting for your rights by demanding that you be punished. I think the moment that will live on is his telling the district sessions judge that under the law, you are required to give me the most severe punishment prescribed in the law. That is your duty. But because I believe that law to be unjust and unfair, I confess that I have broken it. I say with pride I have broken it, but I accept that for having broken the law, you have to inflict upon me the punishment which I accept, which is the highest punishment prescribed in the law. Now, it is that image that remains. For if you look upon Mahatma Gandhi's life in political terms, then it was a disaster. He stood for Hindu-Muslim unity and lived to see the worst massacre on religious grounds that not only this subcontinent had ever experienced, but that the world had seen. He must have been an absolutely shattered man. Just as one would think of Nehru's as a politically failed life because of what happened with China in the last year or two of his life. And yet, I don't think that is the way in which they would remain in our memories. For it was not the fact that he became Prime Minister and lived as PM for 17 years and was never defeated, that would really remain. It is the idea of India as a secular sovereign country that stands upon its own feet in order to become the moral compass for the whole of the international community, that you can continue thinking of Nehru. And the same perhaps applies to Emperor Ashoka, about whom H.G. Wells said that, when you look through the corridors of history, there are tens of thousands of emperors and conquerors who crowd these corridors. But the one person who shines out is the one who just near Bhubaneswar, at Kalinga, looked with horror at the means by which he was going to spread his empire and said no more war, and yet became a much bigger emperor because he eschewed violence than he would ever have been if he had continued along the path of violence. That Jesus Christ was a 33-year-old seditioner. He was against the state. If it had been our India, he'd have been arrested under Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. And in the 3 years that he was a preacher, it ended with him on a cross next to two thieves and dying in the burning sun with his hands and his feet pierced. And he went away from human consciousness for a long time. And when it got revived, it's a moral force that continues till today. So the point of what I wanted to say is that many people come to power for reasons that are not very noble. And even if a person comes to power for a while, it often doesn't last very long. VP Singh was 11 months Prime Minister. Chandrasekhar was Prime Minister for about 3 months effectively. Mr. Gujral was PM for about 5 or 6 months. And when I would sit on the ramparts of the Red Fort as a Union Minister in the vicinity of Dr. Manmohan Singh and see these others, my mind would be full of thinking that they had also been on those ramparts. But it had finished like this. What is going on in their minds just now? Are they able to reconcile themselves to no longer being what they were, although what they were was an almost unbelievable achievement, because out of 1 billion Indians, only half a dozen have come to that kind of a position. So I end by referring to the importance of somebody who comes on a power list, remembering that perhaps he won't be on that list next year, and yet be happy to be on that power list today, than not to have been on that power list at all. But to also accept that when he is dropped from that power list, he must somehow be able to reconcile himself to walking into this same meeting in, say, 2019, and nobody recognizing him, nobody asking him to come up in front, and sitting in relative anonymity at the back, and not regretting that if 2016 put him on the power list, that 2019 might say goodbye. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.